All right. So I propose to speak today about the economy and maybe to do a couple of classes focused on the economy and in particular the role of the economy in the 2024 presidential campaign. But in order to do that, I'm going to jump way back into the middle of the 20th century and then bring us forward into the late 20th century, the 21st century, to talk about the way our economy has changed, and in particular, and I'll get into the details, but to point out that in certain respects, if Harris is identified with the policies of the Biden administration, those policies have, on the one hand, allowed us to get through the COVID crisis in a better position than practically any developed economy in the world. And on the other hand, of late, have allowed us to both bring inflation under control. Obviously, the Federal Reserve and its high interest rates probably get some credit for that, though it's always hard to figure out exactly how much efficacy different kinds of economic policy have. But make a long story short, inflation has come back under control and interest rates are starting to be cut. And at the same time, the jobs that have been created, the wage growth that has been created, the level of economic growth that has been created, in all these regards, the macroeconomic picture in the United States seems to be better today than practically any comparable economy in the world, and in a sense should be producing robust consumer confidence, robust reports of satisfaction with one's economic situation. And quite the opposite is the case. And so in many respects, I believe Donald Trump sees his most important opening to win the presidency being dissatisfaction with the economic situation of the United States in 2024 and the previous 4 years, and that he also recognizes that most Americans believe the economy was better off when he was president, that they were better off when he was president, and that he promises to bring back the economic conditions that led people to think that they were better off when he was president. And in particular, his theory of how to do that is outward directed, right? To do things not to try to bolster the supply, for instance, of affordable housing in the United States by letting the government get into the business of subsidizing the cost of the production of affordable housing, give incentives to bring the regulatory burdens to rapidly creating this housing down, and subsidize the purchase for first-time home buyers, right? The central elements of Harris's program as she has announced it. Instead, Trump says, no, let's look outward. Let's look at competition from China and other countries and put tariffs in place that will keep them from unfairly eroding the basis of the American economy and our jobs. And on the other hand, let's kick immigrants out because immigrants are unfairly competing with the native born for their for the jobs, for the housing, for other things that raise the cost of living. And that, I think, by most accounts, is not a policy approach that is going to match the needs of our economic moment. It's likely to increase costs on people. It's likely to increase inflation. It's also not likely to actually address the root cause of the problem. But having said that, the idea that people feel that the economy is worse, that the Biden policies have not benefited them, that Trump is a better economic leader, and that the policies that he's identified give them a kind of satisfying scapegoat for the economic trouble that they've encountered, I think all of that is reflected in what we're seeing in the campaign. And so I think it makes sense to spend a class or two trying to figure out why that is. And so with all of that in mind, let me start with where the campaign is and brace yourselves. It is basically a dead tie between these two candidates, right? And to be as clear as possible, right? The idea that the Silver Bulletin, which is the Nate Silver's modeling, the one that I tend to have the most confidence in, that seems to be most sophisticated, that has the longest track record, has this at a dead heat, right? 52 to 47. One way to think about this is that if bettors see a game that they want to bet on or some other event that they want to bet on where there's less than a 53% chance of one side winning, they tend not to bet because essentially they say that's a tie. The difference in the odds are not worth wagering on it. As you can see, right, Trump has come up, Harris has gone down. According to The Economist, if the election were held today, Harris might win the Electoral College. She is narrowly ahead in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada. That gives her a path to victory by 2 Electoral College votes. And I want to be as clear as possible. If that is the margin of the victory, you can bet that there will be multiple, and if things go badly, protracted lawsuits challenging the accuracy of the results, state by state, county by county, polling station by polling station. It may be a long, difficult contest to determine whether or not the initially registered vote is the one that will be ultimately certified as legally binding. Now, coming specifically to the economics, and here I want to juxtapose the economic data with the economic mood, right? The idea that inflation is back down below 2.5%. We saw this again in data that came out about a week ago. That growth is at 3%, right? That's a relatively strong figure. That unemployment is at around 4%, right? Again, a very strong figure. That's the Fed's target. That the economy has created about 7 million more jobs than it had before the pandemic, right? And I want to be as clear as possible. A lot of the job creation under Biden was recovery from the COVID pandemic. But having done that, the economy has continued to grow, and we now have a large number of more jobs than we had prior to the pandemic caused recession. The stock market's at all-time highs, if you care about that. Many Americans are getting sizable pay raises, and middle class wealth has surged to record levels. Again, I think that's extraordinarily important. We'll get into this as we go through. One of the things that we're going to look at is the idea of a patrimonial middle class. And the term there, right, comes out of earlier economic periods when the patrimony was what the father passed down to the firstborn son, typically, i.e., middle class wealth is an inherited wealth in the 21st century in America. It is extremely important that the middle class is starting to do better, but it does not tend to improve the situation of the bottom 50% of our society. And so I think we need to be clear about the difference between middle class wealth and wealth for everyone at the bottom of the economic distribution, despite the fact that we live in a society where almost everybody calls themselves middle class. The Federal Reserve has begun to cut interest rates, right? And those are right that relatively large 50 basis points, 0.5% cut in the Fed prime rate hasn't really percolated out into the rest of the economy yet, not in terms of mortgage rates or credit card interest rates. That takes time. That's affected in part by what's happening in the bond market as well. And so we shouldn't probably expect to see the interest rates that affect ordinary people's purchasing decisions or the level of payment they have to make on their debts come down prior to the election. But nevertheless, it does appear the economy is trending in the right direction. And foreign leaders talk of the US economy with envy because, right, their economies are struggling, whether we're talking about Japan or Britain or Germany, right, that the other economies in the world that tend to rival the US in terms of efficiency and wealth creation, even China right now in the doldrums, the US is uniquely experiencing a rapid and thorough recovery from the COVID pandemic and its economic effects. And one would think that this might influence economic sentiment. But according to the most recent, right, New York Times Siena poll on this, right, 75% of likely voters say the economy is fair or poor. Now, there is a silver lining in this for Kamala Harris, and that is that the majority of voters are now close to trusting her as much as Trump to manage the economy. It depends on which poll or which survey you're looking at. And some surveys suggest that working class people, blue collar people, union people, middle class people trust Harris more than Trump. That the message that Trump's economic policy is biased to the wealthy is maybe getting through. But having said that, right, going back to this for a second, right, note that when I say these are wildly dissimilar candidates, right, Donald Trump is a former president of the United States. And that is both an advantage and a disadvantage for him. He's clearly a known quantity, but he's also a convicted felon. He's also a serial liar or someone who has no real desire or appetite to distinguish truth from falsity and rely exclusively on truth. He is being routinely criticized by members of his own party for saying things that are false and damaging as states try to dig out from under terrible hurricanes, as places that he's criticized as having migrant crises that he then visits are saying it's just not true, right? And so the idea that Harris and Trump are running neck and neck, I think it in part just points to how impervious to argument or to judgment our politics have become, right? We are so dug in our partisan identities. They have become such encompassing identities. They define who we are in terms of our racial identity, our class identity, our religious identity, our regional identity, that there's very little that the facts can do to penetrate and influence us. But having said that, there are these states, right? The 7 states that we remain focused on in our catechism of undecided voters, the states that have a portion of voters who are undecided such that they could swing either way. Um, and I'll just note, right, Harris got a good poll result in Pennsylvania from the Times today, showing her, I think, up 6 points. Trump got a good poll result in Arizona today. But in the average of these polls, it does appear that Harris's lead in Pennsylvania is less than 60-40, that Harris's lead in Michigan and Wisconsin is less than 60-40. And so that makes these essentially toss-ups, that brings it back to those undecided voters. And I don't think those undecided voters are responding to the macroeconomic data, right? The data that you read in the business section of the newspaper or that you see on the business channel, they're looking at their own pocketbook. They're looking at whether or not their savings account is larger today than it was 4 years ago. They're looking at the grocery prices, the gas bill, the utility bill. They're looking at their neighbors and whether or not they think their children will be economically secure, whether or not their neighbors' children will be economically secure 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. And they are concluding that the economy is a little bit better than it was a year ago. That Harris appears to have some new ideas that maybe Joe Biden didn't have, but that they're not confident that the economy is good enough or sure that Harris is going to be able to implement her ideas. And they're wondering which of these two candidates might be a little bit better for them economically because they are not happy with their economic situation. And so my claim is easy, central, that the broad-based macroeconomic data do not get us in touch with the economic sentiment of the ordinary voters, and in particular, voters who are likely to be determinative of the outcome of this election. Now, I'm going to point out very quickly, some of you, I think, read Heather Cox Richardson's Substack, and she had a piece on this today, which said basically this is a problem with long-term historical bias against the Democrats. That the data, and I didn't actually reproduce the data that she reports or some of the data that I have in the books I read, but the data on Democratic presidents as opposed to Republican presidents seems to be pretty clear. That actually the economy grows better under Democrats, the stock market does better under Democrats, that ordinary people do better under Democrats, that the tax code is fairer under Democrats. Now, having said all of that, I think we have to be careful in assuming that the president is directly in charge of economic results, responsible for them, and so deserves credit or blame. But having said that, on Harris's view, the reason people are dissatisfied with the economy and looking to Trump to improve it is mere historical bias. And I don't believe that that is accurate. And that's where I want to go today. I believe that around 3/4 of the voters feel that the economy is fair to poor, that the people who are likely to determine the outcome of this election are looking for concrete and credible assurances that the next president of the United States will make things better for them because they are nervous. They have not seen their economic situation improved under, right, Joe Biden enough for it to matter. They've not seen their economic situation improve under a number of Democratic presidents enough for them to really have concluded that they're just better off when the Democrats are in the White House. And that may be what the data shows, but clearly, again, the data reflect things that are true of the economy as a whole, not the lived experience of ordinary voters. And so I'm going to go back for a second. I didn't speak to the image that I began with today, right? The Edgar Degas image of women ironing, a painting that he spent a lot of time working and reworking to get to the place where he felt satisfied with it. And part of my reason for choosing that image is to point out that it's one thing to say we live in the Belle Epoque, right? Which is when Edgar Degas is painting, right? We live in a period of remarkable economic growth and productivity, and yet, right, where do those nice ironed collars and sleeves come from? They come from the back-breaking, hot, difficult work done by women who you never see, right? That's not picked up in the economic data, but that is the lived experience of the working class in the late 19th century in France. And by the way, the lived experience of the working class, the bottom 50% of our economy in the United States today, says, okay, you got great numbers in all these regards. It is not translating into a better life or greater economic security or less precariousness for me. And so I'm not going to vote on the basis of the top line macroeconomic numbers. I have to be convinced that my life is going to get better. And that's where I want to drill down. Why is it that people are not convinced that their life is going to get better? And in order to do that, I'm going to, over today and the next time we get together, present two different dialogues or debates, and between two different people reflecting on the economy each time. The first one is going to be between Carl Polanyi. I'm not sure whether many of you would have heard of him before, um, but he is a fascinating figure. He is, as perhaps the name reveals, Hungarian. He's part of an aristocratic Austro-Hungarian family. He grows up in Vienna. He's a very gifted and respected economic journalist. When the takeover of Hitler in Germany occurs, the annexation of Austria, he flees to the United Kingdom, where he works in Cambridge, England, for a few years during the war, and begins to turn to more academic study, and eventually, after the war, relocates to New York and teaches at Columbia University, where he really founds the first program in economic anthropology. And it's a peculiar combination of disciplines, right? Economics in the neoclassical model assumes a core model of human economic rationality that is culturally invariant. Anthropology looks at how cultures vary and change and give you specific ways of looking at the world. And Carl Polanyi wants to combine those two disciplines. It's clearly a shot across the bow at mainstream economics, saying that economic rationality is all that determines how economic agents operate. And Polanyi is much more interested in the way in which society relies on values to regulate economies, to embed economies, as he famously puts it, and what happens when an economy escapes the embedding that social values attempt to bring to bear on it, when it starts to operate on purely economic values as opposed to broader social values. And the book that he's most famous for, a book that is still very widely read, and by the way, there's talk of a quote neo-Polanyian renaissance in the last decade. A lot of people going back to him. It's not just me who are saying, look, he got some things really right in the second half of the 20th century that really help us to understand what's happening in the first quarter of the 21st century. So his most famous book, The Great Transformation, The Political and Economic Origins of Our Time, was actually written in Cambridge primarily at the time that he was right? A refugee from World War, and trying to understand what happened in the buildup to the World War that led to fascism, that led to World War, that led to Nazism, that led to the Holocaust. And this book is a monumental effort to try to explain all of that in terms of what the social consequences of an unregulated economy are. Benjamin Friedman, and I don't know how many of you again would have heard of him. He is one of the most important mainstream economists of the last 40 years, long serving chair of the Harvard Economics Department, a president of the American Economic Association, a member of multiple think tanks and policy groups, and the author of several more popular books on economics, bestsellers, in addition to the 150 odd very well regarded, very technical articles that he publishes in mainstream economic journals. The book that I want to focus on from Friedman is a book that was published in 2004, so it's about 20 years old. It's called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, and it is making an argument that economic growth, when it is sustained, produces a morally better society. And that therefore we should continue to want an economy that is a market economy capable of producing high rates of economic growth, that we are a better, fairer, more inclusive, more progressive society when we have sustained economic growth. As a matter of fact, the sustained economic growth causes us to be a more progressive society. And I hope the difference is clear. Polanyi essentially says if the way you get sustained economic growth is by deregulating your economy, then what you ultimately get is war, fascism, genocide, when society revenges or protects itself against the damage that the economy is doing to it. And by the way, I think the idea, and I think both of these thinkers, in many ways, I'm reread their works to get ready for this class. There are many passages where you look at them in 2024 and you go, oh my God, they're predicting Donald Trump, right? Obviously they're not, but they are predicting that an unregulated economy, an economy that does not create a broad base of economic security, is going to produce populism, nativism, limit our generosity to each other, cause us to look for scapegoats, and maybe even go to war. But having said that, then their explanations differ fundamentally. Is it the fact that the economy is unregulated, or is it the fact that the economy is growing slowly? That's why I think this is a productive dialogue to mount between them. So let me start with Polanyi's work, and his is a historical work. It offers a history in particular of the last, well, let me put it this way, the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. And his central claim is that the 19th century can be viewed as 100 years peace. And in saying that, he's not claiming that there were no wars as far as the European powers were concerned in the 19th century, but those wars were not wars that were primarily fought in Europe, that they were fought in the colonial periphery, and that they were not world wars, that they were wars that were over territory in the colonies, skirmishes in Africa or between Japan and Russia, but not wars of the kind we saw in the 20th century. And that then the 20th century has the opposite feel to it, right? Two world wars in the first half of the 20th century, fascism, genocide, and he wants to say that all of this is the social impact of industrialization and the way in which industrialization was structured and unfolded over this 150-year period. And in particular, he wants to suggest that the social history of industrialization, right? And so the movement of large masses of the population from agrarian economics in villages where families had lived for hundreds of years, where the law prevented them from moving, to urban areas, the transformation of the economy from an agrarian subsistence to an industrial, progressive economy. Sorry, that all of this needs to be understood as reflecting an unstable, what he calls double movement. And so, as he does his long history of the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, he points out that what national market economies require, and remember that right prior to the late 18th century, there really hadn't been national market economies where the market isn't just a peripheral institution, right? The market literally is a traveling market that comes to your town maybe once or twice a year, and you get your spices and your silks and your dyes, your exotic goods that you don't need, that aren't part of your subsistence, but nevertheless that you rely on coming to town. For your subsistence, you're mainly producing your own goods in your household or trading in a relatively limited, often barter economy. This is true of Europe. This is true of most of the rest of the world for millennia, as far back as we can see really into recorded history. And in the 19th century, especially, an entirely different kind of economy starts to emerge, a national market economy where goods are produced in order to be traded and traded across large distances. These are colonial economies. These are economies in which goods and persons are being extracted from societies that exist continents apart and then being fed into the domestic European economy to produce its wealth, and then being fed back out into the triangle trade with Africa and the Americas and Europe. And the double movement here reflects the fact that the national market economy requires that traditional social economic regulation be removed in order for it to operate. And I'll give the central example that Polanyi uses, and this is of the right to have enough income not to starve. And there are various poor laws that are passed throughout the 19th century in Europe. The one that he spends the most time is a form of the poor law that essentially says every person is entitled to enough money to purchase a loaf of bread per day. And he points out that it takes a while for many European peasants who have been displaced from the land that they had been on traditionally, intergenerationally, going back very far, and yet those lands are enclosed, they're pushed out, they have to go to the cities in order not to starve. They're used to working for their living. It takes them a while to conclude that if the employer is not going to pay them enough to keep them from starving, if the working conditions require that they eat a lot in order to be able to muster the energy required of them. Think back to that Degas painting of the women ironing. This is the period in which William Blake writes of uh, dark satanic mills, referring to the textile plants of northern England, right? That the conditions in the factories are terribly degrading and demanding, and so it takes a long time for the workers of England and these other European societies to swallow their dignity and say, actually, it's better for us to take the handout, the dole from the government, which comes with all of these restrictions. We have to live in a poorhouse, but at least we're not going to starve. At least we're not going to be degraded, have our lives shortened by the terrible air, the windowless conditions, the degrading and dangerous work of the newly industrialized economy. And so the effect of the government saying, we're going to give you enough money so that you can eat, is to disrupt the labor market. The workers stop going to work. They go to the poorhouses because they don't want to starve. They don't want to be degraded and put in situations that shorten their lives and endanger their physical health. But then the market economy is disorganized. The labor market no longer functions. The producers can no longer get the work that they need done at the price that they want it done in ways that allow them to continue producing the goods that they want to produce for market. And so you get sharp economic downturns, right? And we think of the Great Depression from the late 1920s, 1930s as being the kind of defining economic shock of our era. But please note that there were three previous depressions that were similar in magnitude that occurred in the second half of the 19th century, and that many economists believe they were caused by economic policies designed to protect the working poor from starving, right? From being deeply damaged by the economic transition that was occurring. And so the only way that economic policy understood to protect the members of society was directly economically catastrophic. And so then economic policymakers reacted and said, no, we got to get rid of the poor laws. And right, this double movement. Either society protects itself from the economy and the economy is disorganized, or the economy is allowed to function according to its own logic and society is disorganized. This is the fundamental movement of this 150-year period in which, right, society keeps defending itself. The economic consequences of society defending itself are the very basis for the material survival of the society is called into question. The economy is allowed to function in the way that it needs to, and then society is under attack again, and society tends to defend itself. And the way in which society defends itself is politically, right? It's by people rising up, forming labor unions, supporting labor parties, threatening revolutions in the middle of the 19th century, and demanding that those who represent them actually work to protect them. So the deeper background here is that a socially disimpeded a market economy that is unregulated, that is allowed to function according to its own intrinsic logic, tends to produce not just a market economy, but a market society. And Polanyi, in his guise as an economic anthropologist, says, look, this is historically unprecedented. In every society that we can find a historical record for, anthropologically speaking, they required that their market, their economy, accord with social values. You can think here of Catholicism's prohibition on usury and on sumptuary, on extreme forms of luxury, right? The idea that just making money by loaning money is not productive and therefore reflects a level of greed or an economic orientation that is incompatible with the intrinsic good of economic productivity, which has to involve doing craft, getting value out of the work, meeting human needs. Those are human values that Catholic social morality uses to regulate economic activity. Um, a market economy can't do that. A market economy requires people to participate in economic activity not for the social value realized, but for the economic value realized. We're going to be talking a little bit later about a contemporary economist called Branko Milanovic. I'll get into him uh, next class, but Milanovic, in a book called Capitalism Alone, argues that capitalism has become the only viable economic system in the 21st century. And that part of the sign of capitalism's uh, unrivaled success in the economics of the world is that you can now go anywhere in the world and bargain, haggle, try to generate maximum profit, try to get your wage as high as possible, try to get the best price possible, and everyone will understand what you're doing. And from a anthropological perspective, Polanyi points out that for almost all of human history, that kind of economic activity, economically motivated economic activity, was prohibited, was considered to be, right, a violation of the values of our society. And so a market economy requires a market society, a society in which economic activity is allowed to be motivated by economic values. This is anthropologically unprecedented because typically economies are regulated to accord with social values. And Polanyi thinks that in particular, there's a deep instability to this kind of society because it tends to undo the values that are required for us to have a humane economy. And in particular, he points to three commodities that he thinks, when they're handled by the market economy, tend to be distorted in ways that lead to individuals or families or communities being vulnerable and leading to want to protect themselves via politics from what the economy is doing to the society. Um, these three commodities, and I think I need to speak to the definition of an artificial commodity, according to Polanyi, for just a moment, are land, labor, and money. And so a commodity, simple definition, something that is produced in order to be sold for profit, right? And so practically everything the market handles is treated by the market as a commodity. But Polanyi refers to these as artificial commodities in the first instance because although they are treated by the market as things that have been produced in order to be sold, that is not, in fact, their anthropological status. If you look at them not from an economic perspective, but from a broader social perspective, obviously labor belongs to the individuals who supply it. And the individuals who supply the labor are not produced in order to be sold for profit. They are some mother's child, ultimately, right? That they are people with concrete biographies, with loves, with values, with religions, with commitments, And if you treat them purely, at least from the perspective of the sale and use of their labor, as nothing other than productive inputs from which maximal value should be extracted, then you end up not only ignoring, but very often damaging the humanity of the person who supplies the labor for you. So, an artificial commodity that cannot be adequately protected if it is fully commodified. Land here, Poyani refers to two things. First of all, literally, the physical ecology of the planet Earth and of the territory governed by a particular society. And right, the dark satanic mills of 19th century Europe didn't merely dehumanize the people who work in them, they also raped the surrounding nature, the surrounding land. The data on this is astounding that more than 90% of European forests had been cut down to be used for productive inputs by the end of the 19th century. 90% deforestation, and this was resulting in right topsoil erosion, the destruction of entire ecosystems, and a rapid decline in the quality of air. We think of London as being a foggy city. The fog was actually smog from the burning of all of those trees and coals, right? And please note that the only way the industrial economy was sustained after Europe had essentially deforested almost all of its wood was on the one hand from the transition to coal, and on the other hand from colonial deforestation and the repatriation of wood from the colonies to Europe for the use in its economy. And in addition to nature being understood simply as, I'm sorry, land being understood simply as the natural environment of the society, land is also the place where humans live, right? And so the second connotation of land here is what happens when you commodify the housing supply, when you treat it as something simply to be produced in order to make profit. And if you know something about the history of tenements in urban societies in Europe and the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you know that, sorry, give me one moment, that people were living in levels of urban density and concentration, right? 20 people to a two-bedroom apartment in a tenement where they literally filled the whole apartment with beds, but then people slept in shifts. The idea that the bed was never cold because when somebody got out, somebody else got in. This was the way in which landlords and industrialists extracted maximum profitability from land in this narrower sense, the place where human habitation comes from or is situated. Finally, and this may seem peculiar, right, to call money an artificial commodity. What is a pure commodity if not money? But again, Polanyi, I think, is onto something here. And what he is suggesting is that when a society distributes and allocates its resources for production, it is essentially making decisions that determine what is going to be produced at what quantity and what kind of economic conditions are thereby going to be secured. And again, remember that by the time Polanyi is writing The Great Transformation, we've had four major Great Depressions in a 75-year period, and these are the product of speculative investment, what another person at the time, John Maynard Keynes, called the irrational exuberance of the market, um, leading to vast commodity bubbles, right? Paying way too much in order to try to make profit off of goods, and then to vast crashes, which destroy the productive capacity of the society, right? Factories are shuttered despite the fact that people need the wages and are starving during economic depressions. And so Polanyi's final claim here is that when we let the productivity of an economy be structured according to only the profit calculations of the people who own private capital, the result is that the society as a whole is on a roller coaster ride from boom to bust and back again, and that it is terribly dehumanizing for the population of the society. Now, writing in the middle of the 20th century, Polanyi offered a solution that he thought would get us out of the double movement of the effort to protect society from the market's tendency to treat everything as a commodity and protect the economy from what happens when some society says, no, we're just going to feed the workers if you're not going to pay them a minimal living wage. And then, by the way, the workers have to live in the poorhouses and not go to work anymore, and that causes an economic crash. What Polanyi calls for is socially embedded market economies. So maintain a market economy, but do so in a way that requires that it perform according to certain metrics of value. We want there to be economic security for everyone, and especially for the bottom half of our society. We want decent living wages. We want affordable housing. And so the way to do this is to partially decommodify goods, the inputs into the market, right? And so don't remove labor from the market by creating poor laws, but instead regulate the way labor enters the market by creating minimum or living wages, by creating laws that allow the workers to unionize and then to bargain and thereby to protect themselves from the depredations that the owners of capital tend to impose on workers when they're not regulated. Create maximum working hour legislation, child labor legislation, so that nobody is forced to enter a dark satanic mill, especially a child. Create occupational health and safety standards so that workers get clean air, so that going to work doesn't create disease or shorten your lives. With regards to land, a second central artificial commodity, a good that is not produced in order to be sold, but that market economies tend very often to treat just as a free resource from which we're going to take everything, all of the trees available to us, right? And then, by the way, dump all the refuse back into it as if it just has an infinite capacity to absorb our polluting byproducts. As opposed to that, regulate the environment. Set aside some land to be genuine natural preserves, but also regulate how much deforestation, how much use of other resources, how much pollution can be discharged back into the environment. And by the way, in the second connotation of land, create through the government affordable housing, public transportation in order to get workers from the place where the affordable housing is to the place where the job is. Build the natural environment and the human environment to realize human social goods. Finally, in terms of money, we need central banks to control the money supply. We need redistributive taxation, which on the one hand prevents inequality getting too great, and on the other hand funds institutions like public education and public health care that equalizes opportunity and shelters vulnerable people from the vicissitudes of the market. We need old age insurance. We need other policies, forms of welfare that protect people when they become unemployed or when there is a massive economic downturn. And then we need financial regulations, including regulating exchange rates to allow governments to have the power over their domestic economy without it being hijacked by globalization or global economic speculators. And I don't want to say that Poyani is the only person who makes the argument for this kind of partial decommodification of central goods, or alternatively, that his book is the reason that in the next 30 years most European economies, and to a large degree the American economies, actually do what Polanyi recommends. Keynes is also extremely important in this story, as are thousands of other people working on the policies, lawmakers, political leaders, presidents, people working in universities. But I do want to say that Polanyi, in a sense, I think offers the clearest and most compelling and perhaps the most influential argument for this idea of the kind of welfare state capitalism that is characteristic of the second half of the 20th century, or at least the 30 to 40 years following World War II, and that this is what has been dismantled in the intervening 40 years. The 40 years from 1980 to today have seen so much of what Polanyi recommended undone. And that, in one sense, part of the reason then that our economy is not meeting our needs is that we've lost the focus on the idea of a socially embedded economy. In a sense, it was easy to remember the lessons of the first half of the 20th century for the 30 years in which their shadow loomed so large. But as we turned the corner, as the Soviet Union, collapsed and we entered a new era of globalization, we stopped paying attention to those lessons as much. And the result is that we have a much less humane economy in the 21st century. And that's in part driving a return to the idea that maybe society needs a strong man to protect it from a dangerous economy that is letting loose the forces of globalization, immigration, trade, downward pressure on wages, and that we need to fortress the United States. I think, in a sense, if we want to try to make sense of the very disturbing, finding that, a few weeks from the election, this election is a dead heat despite everything that Donald Trump seems to have done to disqualify himself, getting a handle on the economic history and its problems for the last 40 years is a really important place to start, and Carl Polanyi helps us to do that. Let me stop there. Happy to take your questions, your thoughts. Who wants to start us out today? Go ahead, Flossie. Got to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Just fine, thank you.
I remember Berkeley in the 40s and the 50s as a place where there were cooperative, beautiful grocery stores and places where everything was actually organized to take care of the elderly, like Strawberry Canyon. And we took it for granted that there would be co-ops and that there was a sense of community, slightly tinged by being accused of socialism or left over from communism. but it was a good time to be alive and to have some expectations that didn't depend upon stepping on others. And I look back at it now as a kind of paradise. I just thought I would share it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Flossie. That's very touching. And when I think back, obviously I have no memory of this period. I wasn't alive, but my grandparents founded a cooperative school in Washington, D.C. In part because, and here we got to add, in terms of race, that the schools in Washington, D.C. were still segregated, right? And so they wanted their children to have a desegregated schooling environment, and they, with a bunch of like-minded people, put a school together, right? It's actually uh, a very well-known school now. They were actually drummed out of the school because they wouldn't fire a communist teacher in the 50s. But yes, this idea of people coming together to do things that maybe the economy didn't do of its own accord. But I think also the idea, and I'll just note, right, that in the 1950s, the CEO to worker pay ratio was 30 or 40 to 1, right? Today, it's often 200 or 300 to 1, right? And the idea that a CEO in the 1950s had to say, look, I got to look my workers in the face. And if I'm making 30 or 40 times what they make, then I can actually be at the annual Christmas party with them and not think that they're gonna just, despise me. But today, right, no such restraints, right? 200 times as much, 300 times as much. And it's, an indication of the way in which this idea of social solidarity, which was, I think, extremely important in the middle of the 20th century, not only in our society, but throughout the European or the developed world, has come apart, and we're in a totally different economic era. So yes, thank you for that, Flossie. Anybody else with a thought or a comment for today? Karen, are you raising your hand?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I was, you can't hear my voice very well. I was wondering what time Polanyi was alive. When was he espousing his theories about the
Um,
economy?
so the book that I'm referring to, which is The Great Transformation, was written in the first half of the 1940s, published in 1944. He was born in 1856 in Vienna, despite being of Austrian, sorry, of Hungarian extraction. That's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he dies in 1964 in Canada, right? So he's alive for a long time. He sets up this center for environmental anthropology. I'm sorry, economic anthropology at Columbia University. Eventually, for various reasons, he moves it to the University of Toronto. And by the way, his daughter still heads that program at the University of Toronto today. But the big work that he's known for is written in the early 1940s, but then there's a whole corpus of economic anthropological work, which I didn't go into, but he's trying to figure out, how do different societies, and here he's thinking of medieval societies, ancient societies, tribal societies, kinship-based societies, structure economic activity so that it accords with their values. And he ultimately comes up with various principles, some of them that are redistributive, some of them that are efforts to outdo each other in terms of generosity, some of them that are so-called householding principles, where the household tries to be a self-sufficient unit and takes care of all of its members. But that's the kind of work that Polanyi did after the Great Transformation. I hope that helps, Karen. Okay. Hi, Sarah. Go ahead.
David, are you aware of who Kamala Harris is listening to on economic issues?
So, yeah, I have some sense of the brain trust or the policymakers who Harris is listening to, but I don't think I'm in a position to name names. Are you referring to someone in particular, Sarah?
No, I just wondered whether I've not seen I've not had an opportunity to read or
Yeah,
understand what whether her sources of information are different from what might have existed prior to her nomination.
yeah, and so give me 1 second. My computer is running low on juice, so I'll plug it in while answering your questions. And look, I started with the idea, right, that Biden's economic policies at a macro level seem to have been quite successful, right? And I didn't add, I should have added, right, that wage growth for the bottom 50% is actually in excess of inflation right now, which wasn't true for the first 3 years that Biden was in the presidency. And that the ideas that Biden has embraced. And so I'm going to be really quick about this for now, but to describe maybe why there would be some continuity in this regard between Harris and Biden. One of them, excuse the jargon, is neo-Brandeisian economics. And so Louis Brandeis, right, eventually a Supreme Court justice, but one of the first heads of the antitrust division of the Department of Justice, author of the book The Curse of Bigness, among other things, was a trust buster. And if you are paying attention, right, Lena Khan, who heads the Federal Trade Commission under Biden. And by the way, a lot of Harris's big donors are saying, please fire Lena Khan, right? Don't allow her to continue because she just got this big settlement again. I'm sorry, big verdict against Google, right? With Google being found to be a monopoly. And then the question is, will the judge break up Google? I think, it's really interesting to ask, could Google be broken up into a number of companies in the same way that the baby bells resulted from AT&T having been broken up, 50 years ago? Um, and so one element, and I'll continue now to use somewhat more contemporary language, of the Biden policy has been deconcentration, efforts to try to make the concentration of wealth and power in the 21st century a little bit less easily sustained by going after monopolies, right? Second element has been new industrial policy, right? And the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act all have provisions that say the workers have to work in industries in the United States. When we're doing infrastructure projects, we have to buy steel that is American made. When we're creating the new big wind turbines and solar panels, they have to be made in the United States. When we're making the chips that run our complex computers and artificial intelligence in the 21st century, we want to encourage the industries that make them to be located in the United States. And so I think all of that is central to the Biden economic policy, using the government to bring down drug prices, obviously, Harris has also concentrated on using the government to bring down housing prices. Having said all of that, so I do think that there's both continuity and some new ideas. Let me say two more things about this. The first is that it could be more ambitious. And I certainly think that the people I'm going to be talking about, Polanyi, Piketty, Milanovic, definitely prefer more ambitious redistributive economic programs, but Harris has not been willing to say that or embrace that. And I think there's a simple answer to that, right? Which is, she's a woman of color from California whose father was a Marxist economist, right? And in a sense, the worst thing for her from the perspective of winning undecided voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan is to be labeled a socialist or a communist or a California, San Francisco progressive, right? And so she's running away from some of those labels while at the same time trying to say, I'm going to do things that Biden didn't do and that will be good for the middle class, will be good for the working class. And so that's the big first thing, the circle she's trying to square, right? She's trying to simultaneously not be labeled a socialist, but indicate that she will do new things to benefit the working class, especially in the Midwest. The second thing, and I imagine you've seen this, but new polling is out this week on Tester in Montana that makes it look very unlikely that the Democrats will control the Senate. The argument is actually that they're more likely to win control of the Senate by winning in Texas than winning in Montana. And I think that's a very long shot, right? So please note, right, that Biden was able to do practically everything that he did in terms of economic policy um, in his first 2 years in office. And by the way, while working with some rather conservative Democrats because he had a very narrow majority, and that if Harris doesn't have control over the Senate, the best thing to be said, I think, is, well, at least then she won't be doing the stuff that Donald Trump would be doing in terms of further regressive tax changes, etc. But it would have to wait until the Democrats regain control of Congress for her to implement any new economic policy.
All right.
So I hope that helps a little bit, Sarah. I'm
Right.
not,
Thank you.
yeah, not as detailed as I would want to be. Maybe at some point I can come down to a more detailed description, but I got to do my homework first.
Thanks. Thank you.
Of course. Anybody else for today? We started a little bit late, but now we're running quite a bit late. I know you guys are all locked in your rooms. Wendy, is that a finger up? Go ahead. You're muted still.
Yeah.
Oh, just there you go.
I think I'm here, but
Yes.
who knows? But that's just a quick question. What is the what is the school in DC that you referred to?
So have you heard of Georgetown Day School?
That's where my children went.
My grandparents co-founded that school.
I just got what a thrill I got when you said it. I knew it had to be the same school because I knew its history.
Yeah.
That was why we were there.
Evelyn and Bernard Wanderman
Oh,
and Ethel Butler Blasdale, who's my great aunt. They're all long gone. but they were instrumental in the founding of that school. They
That's amazing.
mainly have been written out of the history of that school because they were unceremoniously fired 10 years later once the school had a board and was beginning really to succeed. It literally started in somebody's living room, that school. My mom, by the way, was in the first class of students in that school.
Oh
So
my.
she was in that living room. But they got fired because the art teacher was an avowed communist, and the board demanded, in the height of McCarthyism, that they fire him, and they didn't. Yes. So there's a connection. A whole line of educators. It's where I come from on both sides.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. All
Thank
right,
you.
Wendy. That's fun to notice, and yes, I have a certain amount of pride for my grandparents having done that, and it remains a very good school to this day.
It's a very good
Yeah,
school,
yeah,
indeed.
yes. All right, everyone. Wonderful being with you. I
Thank
hope you
you.
get
Get
the nerve
better.
virus under control. Thank you. Yeah, and you guys too. Take care. I'll see you all next week. Assuming nothing big happens, we'll continue this topic. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure as always.